Okay.
So yeah, thanks everyone for coming for the lecture with guest speaker Reinhold Martin, a lecture organized by Jana Verankova and Institute of Philosophy of the Czech Academy of Sciences as part of Jana's ongoing research project that she will maybe talk about a bit more. And also the lecture is like framed around the topic that Jana is like exploring a bit in her own like research. But as I mentioned, we are very happy that Reinhold Martin came for a lecture here at Viper. So thank you for coming. And I will just like briefly introduce him. Reinhold is professor at Columbia University at the School of Architecture at Columbia, at GSAP. And he's a historian of architecture and media and intersection of these disciplines, but many other disciplines as well. He's author of several books. You might know he's one of the like very influential book on postmodern architecture, Utopia's Ghost, which was published
2010.
Yeah. And among other projects he did in the last years. Most recently, the book we also have here, which is called Architecture Against Democracy. Very urgent and pressed topic. And
with Claire, we edited with Claire.
Co-edited with Claire Zimmerman. Reinhold was also the director of the Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture at Columbia University, and his lecture today it's titled "Ideal, Material, Aesthetic, Technics, and Dialectics." So I'm curious.
What could this be about?
There will be no slides.
Yeah, see? Just books.
So thank you, Jana, for inviting Reinhold and for organizing this event. And thank you again for coming. And the floor is yours.
Okay, well. Yeah. Anybody else? Is there somebody coming? Sure. Good? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for coming on this lovely evening. I have to say, I've been spending the past couple of weeks in Dublin, and it's been raining every day, and so it's nice to come to Prague for some sun, among other things, sun and really ideas. And for that, I first thank Jana for not just for the invitation, which is very wonderful to receive and to be able to join you here, but also for a kind of running conversation over, I don't know how many years now, that we were just continuing over coffee and walking through your beautiful cities. So I think we'll have a chance to continue that conversation more formally after I offer these thoughts. And of course, Irina, for this amazing space and with so many intersections. You know, the show that just opened, I have old friends and new acquaintances all gathered together, and so it's really wonderful to have the opportunity to think out loud with you, which is what I'm going to try to do. Jana has given me permission to give a theory talk, which I don't often do. We're not allowed necessarily to do these kinds of things in America, in the American Academy. I'm kidding. But not entirely, because that's the context, first of all, that I'm speaking from. And there's some very specific frames of reference that I just wanted to kind of offer to begin with, that I hope will help this make a little more sense. Jana has read the draft and suggested that I give a little context. This is essentially a series of prolegomena. It's that are intended as introductory thoughts, or what will probably be are two books, the first of which is more formally underway, and the other actually has an article published already related to it. But the first is called The Idea of Use, and this is a history of technology, really, and I'm really working at the edges of what we consider to be architectural history in that case. But honestly, but speaking back to the field from those edges, the histories of technology, of media, technical media, of engineering, and many of these reflections are addressed to the problems that arise when doing that sort of work. Why? Because the subtext of that book is, the subtitle of the book is Technology as Symbolic Form, and it's that I'm going to try to explicate for the readers of Panofsky and other, kind of German idealists. That's the ideal part. So, but and the other is called the work in aesthetics. It's about aesthetics, basically, philosophical aesthetics and modern architecture. This is really, I think, a book, if I can say this, that really hasn't been written. A book like this needs to be written, and I'll refer to some other work done in the later 20th century that has been written, against which, effectively, it's from a let's say, an interpretive, but also I would have to acknowledge ideological point of view. The work that I'm doing is written, and we can talk about all that. I sometimes refer to these two things as base and superstructure. So, like the use book about technology is theoretically about the means of production and base, and whereas aesthetics would be superstructure, ideology. I hope by the time we're done that we won't be able to tell the difference as clearly, and that is essentially the point really of both books, and you'll be, let me know what you think, and I look forward to hearing Jana's thoughts there. Okay, so just to begin, everybody. So in the critical humanities, as we might refer to our shared fields, we've heard a great deal lately about a material turn, as it's sometimes called. Among historians of architecture, for example, this turn, if you go to architectural conferences, this turn has been more of a return, I would say, to the history of technology, to social history, to things like materialist geography, Marxist materialist geography sometimes, to labor history, to economic history, to environmental history. I salute Daniel in the back. And to much else besides. I don't know if that captures, he probably is going to object. So, but most of this has been extraordinarily productive, and I think you probably have witnessed in this room much evidence, and in the classrooms and libraries of this city. And some of this actually makes sense if you retain a qualified commitment, as I do, to the premises that have guided historical materialism in the longer term. Often these materialisms leave off the historical part, and they are historical, but they don't necessarily begin and end with Marx. Among these premises is that of the much debated last instance, like in the last instance, a la Althusser, at which mediating levels belonging to what used to be called superstructure peel away, and we arrive at something like the base, beyond which historical explanation can proceed no further. Stated or unstated for historical materialism, this base, and I'm deliberately schematizing in this kind of vulgar Marxist way, is the ultimate source from which capital derives what economists call value, use value in the realm of things, and labor in the making and using of those things. This, I think, at least, is the strongest version of the turn taken by the new materialisms that I'm referring to, back toward the labor theory of value, with concepts like extraction, for which I suggest every time I hear the word that we substitute production, to really bring it down to the means of production, that oil is produced, it's not extracted. And oil is the first of the case studies in the book that I'm talking about. It goes from oil in the ground in Texas to microwaves in Silicon Valley. This is a cross-section through the technosphere and the 20th century, microwaves in Silicon Valley in the mid-century, and photovoltaic panels on satellites designed and launched by Bell Laboratories, among others. So production. So from there, we can travel down a sliding scale of materialisms, descending towards a more polite, less conflictual version of these materialisms, as, for example, in the multitude of actors and networks gathered together in a kind of multi-causal network with, luckily, no last instance in sight, but also usually no domination, no expropriation, no extraction, never mind production. Only socially constructed practices and socially constructed knowledge up and down the line. So I'm schematizing, but I hope at least you recognize. But what I want to address this evening is not the polite, undialectical materialisms and social constructionisms that have become so pervasive in science and technology studies, in the interpretive social sciences, and in certain areas of the humanities, including art history and the history of architecture. Instead, I want to begin by suggesting that a more difficult problem lurks within the premises on which the labor theory of value itself is built. In their simplest form, these premises constitute what I think we have to describe as a metaphysics, for which labor appears as a kind of Geist or spirit that comes to stand symbolically for a whole world of meaning that, when left unexamined, inspires undialectical scholarly piety. So when you say labor, then we must genuflect. And the point is to with Marx, to think critically about what it means to do work. Not just to sort of, accept the metaphysics. Anyway, to sidestep this piety, we must therefore recognize that labor is as much an idea, this is the more controversial part for most Marxists, that labor is an idea as much as it is a set of material and social practices. But just as there can be no labor without the idea of labor, fundamentally there can be no labor, and in much more than the modern sense, I would suggest, without tools. When we recognize, in other words, that there are no workers without hammers or sickles, we see that the metaphysics of labor is a metaphysics of use that derives ultimately from tools, from their practical use, but also from the idea, the a priori in the Kantian sense, idea of their use. In place of a material firmament, the last instance of the extraction of value from labor, in place of this firmament, we therefore have before us, I think, an entire technological complex in which labor and tools enter a doubly dialectical relationship. However contingently the material base is defined, within that base is a conflict, a dialectical one, between the idea of labor and its material constitution. Conversely, sorry, this is the philosophical, this is the abstract part. It's going to get a little more concrete. Sorry. Conversely, I told you, she gave me permission to do a theory lecture. Conversely, to the extent that there are no workers without hammers or sickles, the idea of labor, that is, the idea of using tools, so we don't just use tools, we have ideas about using tools, is a function of the technological complex to which it remains immanent, which is in turn governed by both that idea and by the materiality of use. Both ideas and materialities, they intersect constantly in a kind of permanent exchange. So to illustrate this scenario in a philosophical parable, we can think of Hegel's dialectic of lordship and bondage, or master and slave, which anticipates the struggle between labor and capital that's central to historical materialism. In Hegel, lord and bondsman are bound together, you may remember, by a chain, Kette, that remains more spiritual or symbolic in Hegel's rendering than material. Setting Hegel on his feet, as he said, Marx merely took the metaphor literally and converted that chain into an instrument, or a tool, the means of production, as he came to call it, that mediates the relations of production, the division of labor, the class structure, etc. And if already for Hegel there are no masters or slaves without chains, again, the tool is constitutive, it's not just a transparent instrument, it's constitutive. And correspondingly for Marx, no workers without hammers or sickles, we can now recognize the chain or the technological complex, more broadly, as the precondition for both the idea and the material constitution of labor. But as I've already suggested, this technological a priori is itself both materially and ideationally constituted. This isn't just a material a priori out of which ideation arises. That would be the more classically materialist way to understand it. Rather, they're mutually constituted. And so therefore, we're faced with nothing less than a dialectic of ideal and material processes all the way down. Dialectics all the way down in that sense. Now, okay, before developing this argument, I want to offer another less obvious reason, but that may be more concrete, more strategic, why it may be of interest to anyone thinking about the relation of aesthetics, technics, and politics today, why any of this matters. As you may have heard, the current administration in the United States has taken an interest in architecture. This interest has been expressed in a variety of measures, ranging from executive orders pertaining to government buildings to the rapid-fire design and construction of executive ballrooms and, it seems, perhaps triumphal arches. All of these give priority to classical architecture as uniquely capable of consolidating something like national feeling as embodied in the leader or by the leader in what we might call a latter-day version of the king's two bodies, one in the flesh and the other architectural. The silence, however, of left political theory in architecture, because there really has been silence, at least on our side of the Atlantic, on this particular topic has been striking. I'm basically saying we don't have the intellectual, the theoretical tools to address the political reality that we're facing. Granted, it would be obscene to equate the historical import of ballrooms or triumphal arches with that of the growing network of detention centers by which this epoch will be remembered. But these are of a piece, and we cede valuable critical capacity when we dismiss one as merely cultural or ideological, just kind of ideological cover, that is belonging to a disposable superstructure, even as we rightly recognize the deadly barbarism of the other. But in architecture and the visual arts, the explanation for this silence is more complex. A materialist and social constructionist metaphysics has mystified the world of ideas and of symbols to the extent that when confronted with the material force of such things and of their cultural meaning, things like triumphal arches, which by design don't mean anything, that's the whole point, that we misrecognize that force as an ephemeral myth, something that can be easily sort of seen through or dismissed, rather than the hardened tool or weapon that the users and its users and designers know that it is. So among the most important tutors for the right-wing intelligentsia that has so effectively put such tools to use was the British political philosopher Roger Scruton, whose work, which also includes philosophical treatises on architecture, one of the very few actual works of philosophy and architecture in the 20th century, on painting and sculpture and on music, has exerted a background influence over key strands of the post-liberal New Right, while stopping short of its most radical extensions. So for our purposes, Scruton's Aesthetics of Architecture, a book from 1979, stands as a kind of avatar for a much larger and more heterogeneous political project that has now emerged from the shadows. This well-informed, often technical treatise construes architecture as a public art. Both experiencing and judging architecture are, for Scruton, public activities in the Kantian sense of the public exercise of reason. This is his argument. Whereby the sensory encounter with an artwork, mediated a priori ideationally in the Kantian sense, exhibits the lawfulness of shared values, and it's those shared values that are being enforced with the detention centers. Arguing with Kant that the sensory and the intellectual are inseparable, Scruton thereby characterizes aesthetic judgment as a form of practical reason that, as he puts it, tells us not what to think, but what to feel or do. That's what the archers, I think, are doing. In this, Scruton ascribes to aesthetics a form of tutelary objectivity, a law of belonging and of civic feeling that is broadly moral in character and meets the standards, by his claims at least, of Kant's categorical imperative. Beyond facile dismissals or reciprocal moralisms, materialist critique has yet to formulate a cogent critical alternative. This is the point here. In turning back now to the dialectic of ideal and material process that I began with, I offer this in response. And I'm going to therefore leave the interplay of aesthetics and politics in the background. The aesthetic questions running in the background, and return to the technological complex that I was referring to. And I therefore only ask you to consider that this complex itself in dialectical relation with the arches, basically. In other words, I ask you to consider technology as symbolic form. So in the first volume, and here comes the bourgeois humanism. In the first volume of his philosophy, but it's honorable bourgeois humanism, I think. of Philosophy of Symbolic Forms in 1923 on the philosophy of language, the German Jewish philosopher Ernst Cassirer suggested that close attention to what he called the pure function of cognition, together with the comparable functions of linguistic, mythical, and artistic thought, he'd later add science and mathematics, led to the conclusion that the, quote, the critique of reason becomes the critique of culture. So from Kant, you go to Cassirer, from reason to culture. Cassirer was referring to the Kantian hypothesis that human reason interposed non-empirical concepts or categories. For Kant, these were first those of space and time, between the intuition and the sensible world, which a priori render that world intelligible. By placing the emphasis on epistemological rather than metaphysical conditions of possibility, however, Cassirer opened up a zone of historical inquiry into the symbolic forms or distinct ways of making meaningful worlds and of claiming truth, into which the Kantian problematic could be extended. Adding technology to the list of symbolic forms promises no less than an awakening from the dogmatic slumber, to borrow Kant's expression, of empiricism, social constructionism, and undialectical materialism to which I've been referring. Cassirer's proposition challenges the mimetic or correspondence theory of knowledge, in which representations, reflect the empirical world, while also rejecting Berkeleyan anti-realism. As Cassirer put it, quote, cognition, language, myth, and art, none of them is a mere mirror, simply reflecting images of inward or outward data. They are not indifferent media, but rather the true sources of light, the prerequisite of vision, and the wellspring of all formation. But equally, he steered clear of a metaphysics of the social or of labor as the material basis of thought. Now, Cassirer does not systematically address technology in his 3-volume Philosophy of Symbolic Forms, which was completed between 1923 and 1928 at the University of Hamburg mainly. In a slightly later essay called Form and Technology from 1930, published not long before exile took him ultimately to Yale University in the States, this essay engages that omission somewhat. There, Cassirer vigorously engages contemporary philosophies of technology, and in the process extends his long-standing debate with Martin Heidegger by outlining, so this is the point of suggesting Cassirer go back to Davos and say, instead of starting with Heidegger on technology and being enthronedness and so on, and going forward to post-structuralism, if we begin with Cassirer, we wind up with the kind of dialectic that I'm referring to. This is the argument. So by outlining what could, if elaborated, amount to a philosophy of technology as symbolic form, in this debate with Heidegger. Such a philosophy would, Cassirer suggests, inquire into the conditions of possibility, quote, of technological efficacy, technological formation, just as it inquires into the conditions of possibility of theoretical knowledge, language, and art. No less, it would replace what he called, quote, materialistic ways of thinking with the question of purpose and legitimacy of technology, posed, quote, ever more clearly and ever more consciously in reference to the idea it embodied. So this would be bourgeois idealism, for his Marxist contemporaries. This idea is both form and purpose, eidos and telos. More than the willful instrumental introduction of world matter, technological world-making is, for Cassirer, a, quote, gaining of form, in the fact that the expansion of efficacy, this is a quote, brings about a change in its qualitative meaning, creating the possibility of a new aspect of the world. This is the world-making, end quote. The willfulness of this worldview, as he called it, is, however, twofold. In making the world, the artisan or engineer doesn't simply impose a purpose. That purpose arises from the making, as a tool, quote, sets itself between the first positions taken by the will and its goal. In the process, quote, the goal sought after is for the first time moved off in the distance. So this is a non-instrumental relationship to tools that nonetheless is purposive. In what he calls a foreseeing that establishes forethought, anticipation, projection, but in a manner that we can recognize as a critical alternative to Heideggerian thronedness, or the kind of fatalism of Heidegger. To sharpen the point, Cassirer distinguishes the anti-mimetic sphere from earlier accounts of tools as prosthetic extensions of bodily capacity that are also familiar in contemporary media theory and technological theory. And he refers to Marx, actually, in making that distinction. What he says, basically, what these instruments have to say is, and what they have to accomplish, quote, completely comes to light only because of a kind of dissociation from the tool, rather than an extension. So this is a theory of technologically mediated alienation, not as existential loss, as especially in the later Heidegger, but as contradictory gain of agency, but also of critical reflection. It anticipates a theory of technical media, which Cassirer did not fully formulate in this essay or anywhere else. A related direction that I hope you're at least anticipating, that was known to Cassirer, had been taken several years prior by his colleague in Hamburg, the historian of art Erwin Panofsky, in Panofsky's essay Perspective as Symbolic Form from 1927. A key intervention in the study of what Friedrich Kittler later called optical media. Reconstructing the development of perspectival representation in Western painting, Panofsky's essay doesn't quite cut to the philosophical core of Cassirer's enterprise, which is much more comprehensive, which sought comprehensively to characterize the human subject as an animal symbolicum, a symbolic animal across a variety and indeed a hierarchy of what philosopher Nelson Goodman would later call, with reference to Cassirer, ways of world making. So there's a whole literature that is implicated in this, these references. Panofsky's goal was instead, as Samuel Edgerton has put it, to show that each historical period in Western civilization had its own special perspective, quote unquote, a particular symbolic form reflecting a particular Weltanschauung, a particular worldview. For all its limitations, this coupling of worldview and technique provided precedent for recognizing epistemological modulations within the technical arts, and in engineering in particular, that are comparable but also distinct from those discernible in the visual arts in the form of something like perspective. One important consequence of which is an asynchrony or a dissonance among symbolic forms rather than their alignment or synchronization. So this isn't just about some zeitgeist, So, suggestively, the unfinished fourth volume of the Philosophy of Symbolic Forms contains some reflections on what Cassirer calls basis phenomena that provide a means for navigating this type of dissonance. These are precognitive phenomena that are, as he says, quote, not something mediated for us, they are the ways, the modes of mediation itself. And elsewhere, quote, they're the windows of our knowledge of reality, Cassirer says, that through which reality opens up to us. They're all precognitive. Or, quote, they are the look that we cast out on the world. They are the eye, so to speak, that we open up. Right? As with the symbolic forms as true sources of light, as he says, Cassirer's language obliges him to describe these basis phenomena not in themselves, but metaphorically as windows or an eye. He still needs to refer to material things. If this focus on modes of mediation bears some relation to the study by scholars of media, like Kittler and many others, but it's actually really the people who follow from Kittler, of what had been called cultural techniques. The emphasis on ideation rather than material practice differentiates the two. But again, I don't propose to exchange one thing for the other. I'm just proposing to instead study the two, ideal and material, as antitheses within a recursive process, rather than as either one as transcendental. Or in other words, I'm not proposing, as other media scholars have put it, the study of elemental media here. This is really dialectics all the way down. So, okay, finally, this isn't finally, we're getting to some things that, it's not going to get more concrete, sorry, it's a theory lecture. But we're getting to other sections, let's say. I just basically I'm summarizing this. So what I've argued before is that we need to take philosophical metaphors like Hegel's chain literally as anticipating or requiring something like a material a priori, the chain, right? Now I just want to suggest reversing that and in a sense returning to Hegel and saying, yes, okay, the chain is a material thing that enables this thought of master and slave, but it's also an idea. And it's that interplay between thing and idea that I keep wanting to return to. In other words, the history of technology is one of machines and technical infrastructures as media with which to think, like the chain, rather than a history of machines that do the thinking for us. Now, the difference has acute consequences when what Cassirer calls the critique of culture becomes a critique of political epistemology, right? So we're shifting registers now. In a late book, The Myth of the State, which is published posthumously in 1946, Cassirer sought to confront directly what he called the power of mythical thought that he claimed constituted a novel political technique that arose during the interwar period, which built on ancient foundations in a wholly modern way. And this is very close to Adorno and Horkheimer writing on the culture industry and myth and so on in Dialectic of Enlightenment. But his summary in the book's concluding pages is very sweeping. And basically he argues that the modern politician has had to combine in himself two entirely different incompatible functions. He has had to act at the same time as a homo magus, a magician, and a homo faber, a technician. By political myth, Cassirer meant the synthesis originating in the European 19th century of hero worship, represented by the thought of Thomas Carlyle, hero worship, and race worship by the French proponent of scientific racism, Arthur de Gobineau. So basically two forms of authoritarian and racist thought. Cassirer lays ultimate responsibility for the triumph of this dual myth at the feet of none other than Hegel, but only insofar as reason transforms into unreason. It was the tragic fate of Hegel, he says, of Hegel's conception of history as a tribunal of reason and of the Prussian state as the bearer of the world spirit, that, quote, Hegel, unconsciously unchained the most irrational powers that have ever appeared in man's social and political life. So that's 1946, he's writing this. The synthetic negation of Hegel's liberalism notwithstanding, there remains spheres to which in the Hegelian system the state has no metaphysical access. This is Cassirer's counter-argument to the use of Hegel, and which according to Cassirer it has no business subsuming under its spiritual mandate, art, religion, and philosophy. So again, here are the symbolic forms in place of Kant's transcendentals, on which historical world-making, including that in the political sphere, is based a priori. He's trying to reclaim these from the realm of myth, political myth. And he does this by referring to the movement of myth as a spontaneous product of the imagination on the one hand, in Kant's sense, from there to the historical production of a new kind of political technics, as he calls it, in which, quote, we find myth made according to plan. Accordingly, the new political myths are, quote, artificial things fabricated by very skillful and cunning artisans. In other words, quote, it has been reserved for the 20th century, our own great technical age, to develop a new technique of myth. Henceforth, myths can be manufactured in the same sense and according to the same methods as any other modern weapon, as machine guns or airplanes. End quote. So on the basis of this, Cassirer could argue in the concluding days of the Second World War, when he was actually writing this, that German rearmament had begun prior to 1933. As he put it, quote, the real rearmament began with the origin and rise of the political myths. The later military rearmament is only an accessory after the fact. This fact was an accomplished fact long before that. The military rearmament was only the necessary consequence of the mental rearmament brought on by the political myth. So he gives priority to the thought and the myth, and then the hardware follows. Now, if Cassirer's language of necessary consequence, this one following from the other, still betrays the imprint of Hegel and indeed of Cassirer's own idealism, his rather tragic assessment of Hegel's political philosophy betrays Cassirer's stubbornly consistent liberal humanism. Of the decades-long debate between Cassirer and Heidegger, Peter Gordon, the intellectual historian Peter Gordon, has observed that what began as a philosophical quarrel staged at Davos in 1929 had become, by the time Cassirer had written the Myth of the State, quote, been transformed into a public dispute over the status of philosophy as ideology. As Gordon puts it, Cassirer's philosophical complaint against Heidegger's fatalism became an indictment, quote, of the uses to which Heidegger's political mythological ideas could be put. So a debate about the instrumentalization of thought, but also, I would suggest, about a relation between thought and instrumentality in a more philosophical sense. But as I've said, so my focus here is not on myth or ideology per se, but on the sphere of technological production that includes political technics, on which Cassirer is not only speaking metaphorically when he describes political myth as manufactured. We have to take that literally. We're talking about factories. Within the AEG factory by Peter Behrens, for example, German armament. Within the hidden abode in which both myths and machines are manufactured, we can use the term remediation to translate what Marx meant by metabolism or Stoffwechsel, or material exchange, with the proviso that in the economic sphere, the ideational enigmas of metabolic technological use, including the use of thought politically, be taken more fully into account. The most evident of these ideational or conceptual enigmas is that of use value. So this is a little bit of a turn. We're going to turn a corner here in the concluding, 15, 20 minutes. Use value, a concept that Marx adapted from Adam Smith and from David Ricardo, but matter-of-factly set aside as he proceeded towards the study of exchange values. Marx has very little to say about use value, actually. Exchange values, commodities, and the labor congealed therein. Use values for Marx are simply things or properties of things prepared to enter into the exchange. They're not unique to capitalist societies by any means. Whereas exchange values, Marx wrote in the opening chapter of the first volume of Capital, quote, do not contain an atom of use value. Emphatically, he added, quote, if we disregard the use value of commodities, only one property remains, that of being products of labor. So this is where I want to go behind or underneath Marx and not disregard use values of commodities, and therefore think again about labor. This proposition, the one I quoted from Marx, concisely, of course, restates the labor theory of value that he had also adapted from Smith and more systematically from Ricardo. Marx's thesis that labor power is abstracted and disguised in fetishized commodities, the exchange of which yields surplus value or value greater than the socially necessary labor that produced them, was largely rejected by the few professional economists who responded directly to Marx's work, and again, whom he immediately recognized as bourgeois in his own terms. But I want to just put a hold on that for just 2 seconds. One obvious objection among those who Marx regarded as bourgeois was that if surplus value was entirely dependent upon labor, not only was capital fundamentally exploitative, it was fundamentally unproductive. So they were kind of apologists for capital from his point of view. Now, a different point of view, perhaps more disinterested, might find that the means of production that enter into the Marxian calculus as fixed or constant capital are too easily rendered transparent to labor in the production and reproduction of value. So as you see, we've turned the corner. We've switched entirely away from the realm of ideology and myth and what really is discussed in the German ideology in the first volume of Capital as things like commodity fetishism and so on. We're really now trying to deal with the realm of useful things as such, right? As we've already observed, even in the most rudimentary sense, there's no labor without tools, and there are no workers without hammers, sickles, or tractors. You have to basically accept that proposition in both senses of Hegel's chain, ideationally and materially. Technics produces what it mediates, hence my use of remediation for metabolism to describe a process that is at once derivative and primary. Notable amongst Marx's early critics in this regard was the Austrian economist Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk, who in his response to the posthumously published third volume of Capital, as edited by Engels, addressed what became known as the transformation problem that centered on Marx's efforts to explain how value, which in his system is non-monetary and derives from labor, transforms into market prices. Böhm-Bawerk was one among many to conclude that Marx failed to effect this transformation for economic systems in which Marx what Marx called the organic composition of capital, or the ratio basically of machines, materials, and energy to labor, varied across industries. Many Marxists basically now agree with this critique. This Bombaverk argued pointed to a fatal flaw in the Marxian analytic, which he attributed to inadequate attention paid to the dynamics of supply and demand, but also to the gifts of nature, including fuel sources, which contribute to production yet cannot be evaluated as a quantity of labor. Though this became this is one branch of the controversy. Bombaverk was, you may know, a student of the Austrian economist Karl Menger, who, along with William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras, was a protagonist among the so-called marginalist or neoclassical school of microeconomic theorists in the early 1870s, whose work shaped the institutionalization of economics itself as an academic discipline in most of Europe and certainly in the United States especially, and in the UK. A key concept among these theorists was that of marginal utility, or the diminishing usefulness of a product the greater the quantity consumed, up to the point that the consumer is no longer willing to pay the asking price and shifts her spending onto another, more useful commodity, and so on until the market reaches an equilibrium of optimally distributed utilities. Theoretically, on this account, markets set prices at the margins, optimizing to enable the purchase of just enough of each commodity as consumers deem useful. This is marginal utility. A second generation of marginalists, including Bombaverk, extended this approach from the demand side to the supply side to rewrite the theory of value as a function of diminishing returns. These were quantifiable as a relation among several factors of production, as they are called, typically labor, land, and capital, the proportionate use of which the employer optimizes along a spectrum of labor-intensive and capital-intensive and aggregates to minimize cost and maximize returns across the factors, again tending toward an equilibrium production. This has become more or less a conventional wisdom amongst economists and popular thinkers about markets in most of the world. Okay, a century later, against the grain of neoclassical economics that has now become neoliberal, and despite the rigorous systems-oriented Marxisms, their own rigorous systems-oriented Marxisms, Paul A. Baran, there are two Paul Barans, Paul A. Baran, and Paul Sweezy's Monopoly Capital of 1964 portrayed the Cold War military and industrial complex, mostly in the US, as what we can call, in the language that we've been using, capital's new symbolic form. They do not use this language at all, but this is what I'm proposing. Simplified, Baran and Sweezy argue that among the core functions of massive military spending was to recirculate the industrial surplus. Seen, however, so in other words, that's why military budgets keep going up, because to recirculate the capital. Seen, however, as a means of production for which both the instrumentality and the symbolic form of the tool as weapon were primary, so it's not just the material production of the weapons, monopoly capital harbored an antithesis that went unnoticed by the Marxist economists, whose work still distantly anticipated the withering away of capital and of the state at the hands of labor in the form of a post-colonial proletarian international. I recommend, if you're not familiar with Baran and Sweezy's work, everybody today, honestly, I think should read this. I have a whole other paper about Baran. By the middle of the 20th century, marginalist or neoclassical political economy, by then mainstream, had drawn criticism not only from historical materialists like Baran and Sweezy, this is what they're speaking to, but also and more internally from heterodox thinkers like the Cambridge-based Italian exile Piero Sraffa, with whose work I'm really going to conclude now the theoretical excursus on use value. Whose Sraffa's Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities, beautiful title, Production of Commodities by Means of Commodities of 1960 became a classic of neo-Ricardian thought that placed Marx's hidden abode back on center stage. Sraffa, who had actually delivered to Antonio Gramsci the paper on which he wrote his prison notebooks, they were good friends, was also good friends with Ludwig Wittgenstein. So Sraffa, I mean, you think about what an interesting human being this was. who acknowledged Schrödinger's contribution to his own thought. They used to have like weekly philosophical talks, like lunch in Cambridge. However, strictly Wittgensteinian, Schrödinger's slim, elegant volume built its systematic case through taut, closely reasoned logic formulated in stylized algebraic abstractions. The main objective of which was to provide what Schrödinger's subtitle called a prelude to the scientific critique of marginalism. To measure value in the economic sense, Schrödinger proposed a standard unit that expressed a relation among the tools and materials that were utilized in the production process rather than as labor time. Wages were exogenous to production. They weren't irrelevant, but they were exogenous. They were not part of the calculation of value. Instead of standing as proxy for labor power, a worker's pay was a matter of political struggle with capital for a share of the surplus. Heuristically, Schrödinger posited an economic system in which the proportions of the commodities produced, he uses things like iron, coal, and wheat, exactly equal the proportions of those commodities that are utilized in the aggregate means of production to produce more iron, coal, and wheat. So it's really just the commodities producing commodities. The proportion of these commodities as both means of production and product thereby establish a maximum rate of profit from which the actual rate of profit can be computed without referring to money, basically. Taking into account variable wages and without transformation into prices. This is where it leaves out both wages and prices. In this way, Schrödinger replaced the marginalist production function, which optimized among capital-intensive and labor-intensive processes determined by market-based cost-to-profit ratios measured by price. He substituted for this an alternative means of measuring the productivity of machines, tools, and other inputs by just using other machines, tools, and other inputs with labor as an external variable. Now, all of the relevant commodities in his system, iron, coal, wheat, and so on, are what Schrödinger called basic commodities, which act as inputs to production in an industrial society. He excludes mineral resources as well as land from this category because, as he put it, land and minerals are both, quote, employed in production but not themselves produced. At the other end of the assembly line, weapons are likewise excluded as unproductive. Now, since the time Schrödinger wrote, of course, critical scholarship on anthropogenic ecological change has cast the sharp distinction between technological products and natural resources, nature's so-called free gifts, into significant doubt. Political ecology now locates the technosphere as both product and producer at the intersection of human history and natural history. Land and mineral resources, as well as energy sources, now take their place amongst what Schrödinger's Cambridge colleague Joan Robinson called a who's who of productive goods rather than a special case. Primary inputs like land and labor are of no use to capital without the knowledge and tools to remediate them as use value. That's why it's all production, all the way down. Production, production, production. The same goes in the reverse sense for weapons, the use of which has had to be manufactured, produced, both ideologically and ideationally. As we've seen with Cassirer. So this brings us back to the symbolic form. In other words, the usefulness of a weapon is both material in Baran and Sweezy's sense, that is, to recirculate the surplus, and ideational in Cassirer's sense, as among the conditions of possibility, the symbolic form, in other words, from which a deadly modern myth arises. This is the triumphal arches, right? To Schrödinger's inputs become outputs become inputs, I therefore add the idea of use itself, as the use of weapons, as foundational to the political economic techniques of the late 20th century monopoly capital and of the capitalist state, with weapons production as the primary sort of exhibit A in the place of coal, iron, and wheat. Now, with the proviso that the abstraction of Schrödinger's model hardly suits it to the direct analysis it's very abstract, of historical situations, we can now glimpse, finally, its consequences for our understanding of technology of symbolic form. By recasting the struggle over wages as primarily political, Schrödinger set aside the labor theory of value while also rejecting the marginalist alternative. If labor, or more softly, social relations, thereby cannot be understood as a primordial source of economic value, Neither can these be the ultimate source of symbolic value, as they have become for so much architectural history, as I was referring in the beginning. However poignantly felt, in other words, labor or society abstracted into or by a technical object, whether it's a building, a piece of infrastructure, a farm, anything, a plantation, or a hammer or a sickle, cannot be understood as an elemental basis of that object's meaning, even when it's decommodified, any more than meaning can derive from the desires or tastes of users or consumers, as it does for neoclassical economics. Instead, the matrix of production is mediated a priori by an immanent complex of world-making media, symbolic forms. Among these is it is the particular function of the symbolic form of technology, the a priori technological complex, the chain, to remediate production, just as materially speaking, technological production remediates the symbolic forms, like the real and metaphorical chain in Hegel's parable. This is the technopoiesis that echoes through the dryly scientific phrase, the production of commodities by means of commodities. Right? So this is not just a technical economic treatise. I'm suggested that this is a way of thinking poetically about production. Poetically in the mythic sense, in the meaningful political sense, techno-poetically. So anyway, so much then for the material base. And now just to conclude finally with the superstructure. This is just one, it'll be 2 minutes here. I've promised to, I promised to return to philosophical aesthetics, which I'm going to just do now briefly here in conclusion. In his 1979 treatise on architecture, among Roger Scruton's eclectic philosophical borrowings are two concepts associated with the thought of the German-American philosopher Susanne Langer. The first is the concept of virtual space, or an imaginative extrapolation superimposed on quotidian or everyday space that Langer associates with architecture. Many architects in the mid-century, like Louis Mumford, read this stuff. The second concept, also borrowed from Langer, is that of expression specified as reference. As Scruton points out, numerous philosophers since Hegel have regarded architecture, like music, as an abstract or non-representational art, in which expression takes on features closer to feeling than to representation, right? Architecture doesn't really speak in the way that literature does. It as Scruton said in the quote that I began with earlier, it evokes a certain kind of feeling. This Scruton construes as reference without predication, in which nothing is said by the work, only evoked as feeling. So this is basically saying without saying. In Scruton's estimation, then, architectural expression is impersonal. More so than music, it is expressive of public rather than private feeling. As a non-representational art, he also argued, architecture is a poor medium for direct or even allegorical messaging, despite various iconographical decodings that we're familiar with. But it excels in conveying meaning without words or figures. Scruton called such non-verbal, non-figural meaning rightness, recognizable to the properly educated eye. The silent, tutelary intelligibility of public artworks was a recurrent theme during Scruton's long career as a street fighter in the culture wars, a career that was honored by the attendance of his old friend Viktor Orban at his funeral in 2020. It has likewise proved useful to the avowedly Scrutonian ghostwriters of the two executive orders stipulating classical architecture for federal buildings, who've sought and often, in the US that I referred to, who have sought and often gained plausible deniability for the darkest and most odious affiliations attached to the king's two bodies, physical and symbolic, that they promulgate. This summoning of architecture into politics as a non-representational art, an arch that means nothing by definition, is the other side of the dialectical coin that we've been examining here. Just as we've sought out the symbolic in the material, we must now seek the material in the symbolic. Look closely at the classical colonnades and triumphal arches, and you will see weapons. Millions of them. technologically produced as symbolic form, not only to recirculate the surplus, but to use in a manner for which, once again, Kant gives us the words, purposefully without purpose. This is dialectics once again, all the way down. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Reinhold, for taking my permission to do theory so literally. I think he really surpassed my expectations when it comes to that. So I work on like architecture theory and philosophy, and what I generally like to do is when I'm in architecture school, I talk philosophy and theory, and when I'm in a philosophy theory context, I talk architecture. That's the perfect way to mystify everyone in the end. So in fact, what I would like to do now is to kind of maybe bring the conversation back to architecture. Because, you know, we're at Viper, so we're supposed to talk architecture, right? I think if I understand correctly, what you're trying to do, I think it has something to do with, you know, a critique of ideology, in which, as you said, the material is ideal in a way. It's kind of, as you said, the equivalence between your triumphal arch and the weapons, like sort of kind of trying to reconnect those two terms. Obviously, we could ask to the extent to which this distinction between the ideal and material is even useful in something like architecture, because obviously the kind of chain connecting the master and the slave, that is architecture. That could be a definition of architecture. Because architecture in itself is always simultaneously ideal and a material form. If it exists in its ideal form only, then we could say it's theory. If it exists in its material form only, then we could say it's construction. Since you did a lot of complicated quotes of Marxist terminology, I was also wondering, like, maybe we could bring this back to this famous comparison of Marx in the first volume of Capital, where he compares the architect to a bee, and maybe even go against the kind of Althuserian reading of Marx, because for Althusser, obviously the young Marx is the bad Marx, right? It's like he's interested in the analytic Marx of the Capital and so on. So I wonder what this logic would like turn into if we actually, again, turn to a different form of Marx. So just to quote Marx's comparison of architect and a bee, Marx tells us in the first volume of the Capital the following. He says, I quote, "A spider conducts operations that resemble those of a weaver, and a bee puts to shame many architects in the construction of her cells. But what distinguishes the worst architects from the best of bees is that the architect raises his structure in imagination before he erects it in reality. At the end of every labor process, we get a result that already existed in the imagination of the laborer at its commencement. He not only effects a change of form in the material on which he works, but he also realizes a purpose of his own that gives the law to his modus operandi and to which he must subordinate his will. And this subordination is no momentary act." In another word, what Marx is also pointing is this notion of alienation, which obviously is behind this technological military apparatus, in which the workers are actually, the material and the ideal are kind of split, obviously, in the division of labor, and the workers are deprived of the connection to objects. And I wonder if we went more like back to, let's say, young Marx, like, you know, with this notion of the generic activity of man and this kind of idea of the young Marx, that the essential quality of a human being, it's actually the transformation of the inorganic nature into the expression of culture. I mean, if we went back to something, let's say, like the economic and philosophic manuscripts of the 1844, in which actually the liberatory function of the liberating function of the human being, the generic activity that one he then sees like, is gonna come in communism and so on, is precisely about reconnecting the ideal and the material in, let's say, a new kind of a sublimated way, in turning the human environment, in other words, into an expression of human culture. And which, here we're in Prague, so this is something that this kind of early Marx thinking actually spoke a lot to the avant-gardes, like, the surrealists and others, which actually saw this project, they called for, it wasn't really about the Plekhanov material, but it was really about the motto of Marx, more consciousness, right? This acquiring of the consciousness, this turning into the expression of culture, something that the capital sees, as just the natural resource, whatever. I mean, obviously here in Prague, the typical example is the way in which, the capitalism treats the city as a resource and not an expression of culture. That would be like something that would bring us to someone like Rossi, obviously in the 60s, this kind of a critique. So you talk about your ballrooms and triumphal arches, which I find kind of, really fascinating, especially seeing the news today, what's going on about architecture as a symbolic form, architecture as having a certain meaning, in which sense we could, if we were more like structuralist, post-structuralist, let's say logic of thinking, then we could talk also about the materiality of the signifier, because in architecture the meaning is always in fact ideal and material at the same time. Then you connect it to this Roger Scruton, which, thank you for making me discover Roger Scruton.
Again,
what a lovely discovery. And his philosophy of architecture, which again, I probably should read it, I guess, because I work on philosophy and architecture theory. I think what immediately struck me, like when you mentioned it, he says he does philosophy of architecture. Well, maybe the problem is actually the word "of." Maybe what I'm trying to do in my research is to think like philosophy with architecture, to think the dissonance of the two fields rather than kind of suturing, as a bad use term would be suture, like saying we do philosophy of architecture, we're going to close architecture into this kind of a unity or homogeneity of the one. So thank you for making me discover Scruton's The Aesthetics of Architecture from 1979. What I found quite fascinating on that, and again, as this kind of a resurrection of familiar historical tropes, is in your another paper from EHN, which you sent to me. You describe the way in which Scruton is actually radical anti-modernist, and he wants to return us to the classical architecture. And you mentioned like how this whole movement is also linked to this thing like Leon Krier's rehabilitation of the Nazi architecture, but also Leon Krier's role in the fact that he took part in the destruction of the social housing in the UK. So you mentioned that, and interestingly, you mentioned that, and maybe I would like to ask you about that this Scruton is viciously anti-theory. Which I find quite interesting, to what extent to ask this anti-theoretical moment, much later, obviously in 2000, but to what extent is it linked to this kind of a rise of conservative politics? Maybe that's something you could perhaps address. To what extent this anti-theoretical tendency in architectural scholarship can be also linked to some form of conservative social turn. When we talk about the triumphal arches and ballrooms and so on, obviously, what comes to my mind is this notion of the fascist or conservative right aesthetics. Like the question that I ask myself, why? Like, why are they so fascinated, let's say, by these historical forms like the Baroque, obviously with Trump, we have this cheap reference to Versailles, which, immediately the meaning that we can, we understand behind is the royal absolutism in France. When it comes to Baroque, we can think of the Counter-Reformation here, in a sense. So, but the question is what actually in those aesthetic forms, makes them effective, like for this kind of a conservative or fascist aesthetics? Like, is it this kind of a top-down imposition of unity on a certain space? Like, how would you answer this question? Like why are those people so interested in those forms in particular, and not say in Mies van der Rohe's tubular chair, you know? So what makes them effective? Which again, in the Czech context here, could bring us to this whole, like Richard knows about the monument instrument debate of Karel Tajge, where, you know, Tajge criticizes the monumentality as precisely being something that subjugate man, and that's profoundly linked to this form of alienation, you know. So, and you used the word instrument. So you actually said that Marx turns the chain into an instrument. So, you know, we have this like a monument instrument debate of the 1930s. So again, I wonder what does make the conservative right or fascist aesthetics like effective? Is it the violent imposition of unity on some more like heterogeneous real? Is it which is not in fact a kind of an organic parts-whole relationship but which is something that would be like imposed on a reality whose material basis does not correspond to it? Because like even if we think of Trump, okay, like we have Versailles, but it's a very cheap Versailles, right? It's all like fake gold and it's like and maybe some concrete or I don't know, like some cheap materials. So. So what are those distinctive traits of like fascist architecture? How can we extract like what makes those people so fascinating? Is it like transtemporal values? Like is it like what? Like how would you answer this question? And then obviously maybe the last point regarding to Panofsky, Cassirer, and this stream of thought. I also like listening to you again. It just came to my mind to what extent because obviously if you go to the structuralism like in the 60s, 70s, you also have this notion of like character and meaning. I think Kohun actually refers quite a lot to, you know, Panofsky, Cassirer. So to what extent is it this like some sort of a contemporary rethinking of the notion, like the critique of ideology in true architecture? Is it like a rethinking of is it like a critique of the notion of meaning and character? Like, what's this link to those, like, let's say, language-oriented, linguistic-oriented kind of terminology that those people were using, like in, I don't know, 70s? Like, how would you compare it to your project? So that's possibly it.
It's a lot. Great, thank you. I'll start with the last one, actually, because there's a direct link. Cassirer was not an early reader of like Jacobson and other structuralists, but he eventually did, and he recognized his own. He says it. He basically says this is a sympathetic, you know, kind of approach. But the difference would be this. Really, I have to say, I think this runs through everything that I'm describing here and just trying to analyze. Is to think. Beside language, language is one of the symbolic forms for Cassirer, but is not the governing, doesn't apply through metaphors like grammar or syntax and so on, the governing logic for the others. That's what I was talking about, a dissonance. So in this case, the linguistic arts and or, you know, language practices and so on would provide one Weltanschauung, you know, effectively, and another, not entirely distinct, but not entirely unified either, would be refracted through the visual arts and or the spatial arts like architecture. So that and technology, the technological complexes and systems that I'm referring to, I group together with the other types of chains that, as you say, constitute what we call architecture. That's why I'm borrowing from this tradition that I'm very, very, you know, kind of lightly sketching here, that begins with Cassirer but doesn't end with him, in which there are distinctions that are, you know, old ones that we know between the representational and non-representational arts are activated philosophically to some extent maybe as a counterpoint. Now this actually, it goes in an analytic direction rather than a post-structural per se with Nelson Goodman. He's a nominalist analytic thinker. not a logician per se, but much more closely aligned with analytic thought than he is with phenomenology or critical theory or anything like that. So there are also different intellectual traditions that I think we can bridge this so-called continental divide. This is the title of Peter Gordon's book about the Cassirer-Heidegger debate. It's a very interesting, it's something that we all live with in one way or another in what I was referring to as the critical humanities, because this is applied to vocabulary. Like, to speak about the early Marx is to speak on one side of the English Channel, because G.A. Cohen would write very differently as an analytic thinker about Marx's theory of history, that in a way that does, that the kind of this humanist Marx doesn't necessarily figure. And so to get to that, maybe you're persuading me that I have thought about whether to go with the bees or not, including the bees in this story. And the reason I have not so far, and you can tell me if you accept it or others, is that this does, especially when you make the further connections that I understand strategically, I think it would be very useful and interesting to do what you're suggesting. But the upshot of it, it's overdetermined by the effort to attribute to the laborer, to worker, to labor, a kind of primordial agency that has been abstracted, alienated, and so on by and from the tool. And this is why I'm actually, I said this very, I know I said a lot of things very schematically and quickly, but this about Cassirer's kind of incipient theory of technology, that this is a technology of disassociation. And this is what I think he kind of shares with Heidegger and someone like Bernhard Stiegler, I don't know if people are reading, if people know Bernhard Stiegler's work, there's a kind of Derridian reading of Heidegger basically through technology, Technics and Time, this 3 volumes. Thinks about this kind of before and after purposiveness of instrumental thinking in a manner that's more closely aligned with Heidegger than it is with someone like Cassirer, but is in the same kind of problem set, is dealing with the problem of the relationship between what was in the past, what we know, what we think and what we imagine, and what we do. And I think for me, Marx, the fable of the bees and so on is still like a little conventional in terms of purposiveness. And I could even say insufficiently dialectical, because the worker imagines it in the imagination, and then they implement that, and then so you have a disalienated worker at the kind of beginning of the story. For me, there are no disalienated workers, because their workers are always working with tools, hammers and sickles, even if it's just a hammer or sickle. There's nothing, and that's where these later debates in the 20th century, the early 20th century, Heidegger is the kind of the figure who has probably had the most influence in continental thought on the problem, including on some forms of Marxist thought. But I do think, sort of going back to some of these problems, I'm a big proponent of going back, as you can, I hope, see, to what are seen to be disused or discarded theoretical directions, like old Marxism. By old Marxism, I mean the Marxism of Baran and Sweezy in this case, like pretty orthodox doctrinaire developmentalist Marxism. Why? Because in the world of decolonizing and thinking, power through empire, what they have to say about empire, and Baran almost got kicked out of Stanford because of his support for Cuba, that is much more, I think, sort of challenging than the soft materialisms of, that if you take a photograph in a certain way, that's going to somehow colonize somebody. And I'm being unfair, but I think you probably recognize the critique of epistemological or epistemic violence needs to be accompanied by the critique of real violence, material violence. And what this debate in the middle of the 20th century faced with, what these generations were faced with and what they participated in or were subject to, is something that we still need to reckon with. And especially under the circumstances of thinking, the other questions you were asking about classicism and the role of play by culture in political violence. Now, on the fascist architect, I recommend also these all old books. Barbara Miller Lane Her book on Nazi architecture is still very much worth reading. I see it. And next, I think 1968, I believe, something like that. And why? Because she basically says there is no such thing as Nazi architecture, stylistically, formally, and all the, says yes, of course, there are architects who had certain allegiances, and and there's a lot of recent scholarship, like Paul Jascott's work on Speer and the camps is very important, and there are chains of causality and who knew what when, and he afterwards denied a lot that clearly he knew. And there's a lot of reckoning that has been done and needs to be done still. But methodologically, the problem of style, this is where someone like Scruton, I think, we have to deal with. And we have to deal with him because he read theory seriously. If you read, there are two books, I recommend another one, that you'll find them either hilarious or very painful, depending on how committed you are to certain forms, especially French and some German 20th century theory. One is, it's called Thinkers of the New Left, and he read Althusser seriously, and he and some of it is very facile and kind of culture war, kind of, it's a lot like today's dismissals of woke, this and that. But he actually he's making theoretical arguments against some forms of critical theory in ways that have to be reckoned with, right? I think it has. He later rewrote that book, or kind of re-edited and added some other essays. This is a very funny title, called Fools, Frauds, and Firebrands, Thinkers of the New Left. And that's when this is in 2010, I think. And this work has become, the people who are writing the executive orders, they are readers of this work. And this, if we want to know what we're dealing with, and of course you'd have to translate it into this setting here, and if one is in other parts of Europe, it would be different. In the UK, it'd be different. But he was in the UK mostly, but very. Yeah, he was here. Yes, that's right. He was here, and he was in Hungary. Yes, and that's where he became friends with Orban in Hungary, because he was here. Yes, exactly. He was here working with dissident, anti-communists. Yeah. Right, yeah. So, this is like real history that it's intellectual history, but it's also, as intellectual history, a form, it compels a kind of reckoning or grappling with some of these. I think they are deeply philosophical questions about what something like architecture does or doesn't do in relation to politics. There are aspects of this that I must say that I think that this idea of saying without saying is basically how the new right has operated for the last 40 years. And finally, in the US, they've decided they can just say it. But the saying without saying is a strategy. There's other aspects of this that intersect with conservative political theory, like Leo Strauss, and there's many, many very interesting intertwined, I would say, kind of genealogies and lineages of thought, that if one is going to take a position in opposition, publicly or intellectually, to some of the outcomes of these things, or the more public projections, like the kitsch barbarism of the arches. The one needs to take the thought seriously, just in the same way that some, the critical theorists took Carl Schmitt seriously. So, you don't, Agamben is still writing about Carl Schmitt. So that's the world, that's our responsibility as scholars, I think. Sorry, did I answer everything? No. I probably didn't. Wait.
I think it helps. I think we'll leave it to the audience.
Yeah, there are probably other things.
It's interesting. Just last remark before we pass it to the audience. Like you say, there are no disalienated workers.
Yes.
Obviously, they are not. But what then is the role of the utopian thinking in that? Like, imagine how would a disalienated
that would be back to our conference, yesterday. So for me, the lineage from Kant passes through Simmel, who was actually Cassirer's teacher. And Simmel's understanding of modern metropolitan alienated experience as liberatory, in again a contradictory way, because it can be understood as only for certain people under certain conditions, bourgeois Berliners wandering around Friedrichstrasse or something, shopping, So, but nonetheless, this is where I think the early Marx only gets us so far. because that's still ultimately, and the returns in the Fable of the Bees, relies on or projects or anticipates a disalienated relationship with technology and with commodities and so on, with hammers, sickles, and everything else. And my conviction and claim here is that even under the most absolute decommodification one can imagine, what a tool is a mediator. It's an instrument that is not transparent to the will, to instrumentality, in the sense that you can just do with it what you want and build a log cabin in the woods and you will be, disalienated. No, you're already, Thoreau was alienated. Sorry, I'm speaking American now, but it's a very useful example that Henry David Thoreau, who is a classic example for every countercultural hippie that ever tried to build a utopian, cabin in the woods. His whole project, what Thoreau really gave us was civil disobedience, and that was about taxes, because he wanted less taxes. So anyway, I read Thoreau. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the talk, Reinhold. There's a lot to think about, but there's one relationship that I want to ask about.
Sure.
There's maybe two figures. So the chain is really important what you're talking about.
Yes.
So I understand it's both ideal and material.
Right.
Then the other thing that's important to you, it seems, is all the way down.
Yes.
And so the way, is this a space?
Yeah.
What is the way?
Okay.
Right, and how does the chain and the way, how do they relate?
Oh, thank you. You've given me an opportunity to refer to something that I was intending to refer to in response to you. So I wrote another book recently, not so recently, but it was published in 2021, called Knowledge Worlds. I feel like I've been living in this book for the last, I don't know how many, couple of years, because it's about the history of universities in the US since the late 18th century. As boundary problems, both vertically and horizontally. Like, it's about the gates, it's about the hierarchies, the admissions program, all of this. So that book begins not in a university, but in Thomas Jefferson's Virginia at Monticello, with another figure of thought, we could say the figure of the dumbwaiter. I don't know if anybody's been to Monticello, or if you know about this. This is something you need to think about in section, in the way architects think in cross-section. And it's an above and a below relationship, upstairs, downstairs. So in the dining room at Monticello, if you go in, the tour guides, they proudly point this out. In the sides of there's a fireplace. In the sides of the fireplace are built in what are called dumbwaiters. And these are chains, they're physical chains with a little container, a wooden box that can be pulled up and down between the dining room above and the wine cellar below. So the idea, in the dining room, this is the Habermasian public sphere, and of learned civic public discussion in which the future of the Republic literally was being discussed. Now, of course, the food was being served by enslaved persons. There were other devices that called dumbwaiters, other types of dumbwaiters that kept those enslaved people out of the rooms. So why? Well, that's why they're called dumbwaiters. So they can't overhear the conversation that is being spoken. The words are being spoken in the room by the learned, enlightened figures, and discuss that outside the official public sphere of the room. Down below is another enslaved person in the wine cellar. Serving the wine. So when Mr. Jefferson could send a signal like tapping on the fireplace, and we need more wine, and the wine would come up magically in the dumbwaiter. That's the chain, right? That's the chain of slavery, of vertical hierarchies, all the way down. And it doesn't end. The point is that it doesn't end at the basement of the building. And the way I try to, literalize that, but also in the same spirit that you're just referring to render this figural, is that by a century later, around the turn of the century, one of the central problems of use this is the first section of the book I'm talking about, in much of the industrial world was that of oil, because oil, what we call oil, wasn't used the way it is now as fuel until around 1900. Oil was Shivelbush, it was disenchanted night, it was illumination, kerosene. The Rockefellers got rich on kerosene. And so it's an empirical question, but it's also a theoretical. There's this stuff all the way, thousands of feet underground. So it just keeps going. That's the technosphere that goes from all the way there to way up in the sky. And all the way up and down that line, that's another technological chain, there are these kinds of dialectics. And so that oil, now today, of course, we recognize oil as a figure of domination. In those days, it was just like this stuff that was pouring out of the well when you're trying to get water, because they were trying to make Texas part of America by turning it into an agricultural state. And instead they found oil. So, and then, anyway, there's a much more to say about that. Make sense? Yeah? Dumb waiters, oil, underground. All the way down. Yeah.
I have a completely crude question, but I
Please.
can't get it out of my head. I think it's coming back to some of the stuff that Jana was talking
Yeah.
about. But I mean, I was also really struck by so the way you brought Scruton into this, and you were talking about how sort of right-wing ideologues have had this sort of emerging philosophical, for lack of a better word, theoretical discourse for a while, and it's being implemented now. They're saying what used to simply not be said and was about not saying it. And you, at the beginning of your talk, you said sort of we don't have an equivalent on the left.
Yeah.
But what I'm thinking about is, okay, Scruton. And it's really weird because I was just texting with a friend about Scruton this morning.
Uncannily, that's because because I know you told me. Okay.
Oh, yeah. I don't,
Not surprising that the Committee on Social Thought would
yeah.
take that.
But, okay, his connection with Orban was literal, and
Yes,
who knows
direct.
what kind of discussions they have.
There's a
What
book.
I
There's
can't-
a secondary. There's this guy who wrote a book about it.
Yeah. What I can't get out of my head is just thinking, our dear president has not read Scruton.
No, of course not. Yeah.
And yet there's this sort of overdetermination
Yes,
on this
yeah,
level
yeah,
of,
yeah.
for lack of a better word, aesthetics or non-aesthetics.
Yes. Yeah.
And his aesthetic sense seems to have been generated from reading Richie Rich comics at the age of 6.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to figure out, like, what, how do we reconcile that? Is this just some kind of, it's not a coincidental overlap.
No.
But what is it?
Yeah.
Is it, is it kitsch? I mean, do we get to, is this some way in which these arguments about sort of morality and aesthetics come in through the back door?
Yeah.
I don't know. What?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, actually. And it is, this is a kind of perpetual question when you talk about politics and culture in one degree or another. The ones enacting the policies are not going to be like the readers of the philosophy. But my own kind of estimation at this point is that it's very important to recognize that the purpose of the various monuments and the idea, are what they say, what the king with the two bodies says they are, which is nothing. The point is that they mean nothing, but they do that in a way that Adorno himself, who recognized the structural function of negative thought in earlier iterations of this, like a kind of nihilism, would have he'd probably be turning around dialectically in his grave as we speak, because instead of simply negating the possibility of meaning, the way a nihilist would, and these guys, the Scrutins of the world, they take all that philosophically very seriously, and they blame it all on Nietzsche. And God is dead and everything. So that this isn't nihilism, though. That's the problem, in a sense. It's if only it was simply nihilism, then we would have the tools intellectually, critically to address it. This is actually a kind of theology, but it's a negative one that in which, to put it in the Hegelian terms I've been alluding to here, in which the aesthetic proposition negates the negation. It promises meaning, but it withholds that promise by definition. What makes it meaningful is the withholding of the promise of meaning. So it's not that it promises and then defers and doesn't deliver in a kind of post-structuralist sense that of a perpetual kind of deferral, but rather that in order to do the work, the ideological work that we're talking about, and if we could even call this ideological in Marxist sense, it needs to mean nothing. It needs to be acknowledged everywhere that it means nothing, and I think that's there. It's just right there on the surface. So so basically what I'm suggesting is not that we don't try to read behind or deeply into these things. They are what they say they are and what we think they are. The other example I would give is the Trump Tower. So that because you have to say that it's not just classical architecture or anything like that. The Trump Tower is about not being in the right place. It's all about being on Fifth Avenue, but being in the wrong place on Fifth Avenue. And it's on lower Fifth Avenue from the point of view of the elite. Because Central Park East, Fifth Avenue on the park, sorry, this is very parochial, but where like Jackie Onassis would hang out and stuff like that, Trump was excluded from that society. And so this was like a kind of in-your-face, you couldn't miss it, claim on Fifth Avenue. Very obviously, bling, this is more Studio 54 and kind of disco bling than the classical stuff. But it's doing the same kind of work by just basically directly addressing in a negative form, in a kitsch form, the pretensions, the perceived pretensions of those a little bit further north. So it's just literally the wrong address. And by being the wrong address, it is the right address from everything that we're talking about.
There's also the military parade, like which we saw in France, the Bastille.
Yeah. Well, I was of course alluding to that with, Okay, so. Sorry. Yeah, the question over there, yeah.
Okay,
sorry.
Thank you first for the engaging talk. I really appreciate that. I mean, it engaged the full without images and without.
Yes. Oh, good. Okay. You made it through.
One's brain.
Good.
Fully.
That's excellent exercise on a Thursday evening.
I'll get to the question. I'm trying to think, to pick up on some of the last things you said in the original presentation, and you touched them already.
Yeah.
My question is basically about the temporality and about the time dimension of this. You've presented a lot of brilliant ideas that have been around, sort of a conversation across decades or even a century with Marx, back and forth.
Right.
And there's now this very strong idea of return, which the conservatives themselves, it's kind of their idea. We're going back to a point which is there.
Right.
But it's also in a way different, the situation now, these kind of grotesque aspects that Jana mentioned, like the Trump stuff, that's the pitch really. Yeah. But it's only one thing, but it's not the same, it's not a return, especially for us who really start their thinking from looking at things and then getting to the ideas. So if there's some kind of dimension to think really what is different about the current situation, because we can probably agree that things are worse than they were 10 years ago. So maybe I think it was there in your thinking, but if you can kind of stress it or maybe return to the fact how to kind of, because we have all these brilliant intellectual tools that have been there, ideas have been there for decades, but it's also kind of frustrating that things are coming back, but maybe they are not coming back in the same ways.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's fascinating to try to think difference and repetition at the same time, to borrow a phrase. But, here there are several levels that one could think to try to stick with the baseline of this presentation at least. We could ask that question from the point of view of the technological complexes that I'm referring to, or media complexes as I will more frequently call them. And so, of course, there is something new every step along the way from the point of view, if you go from, I know I didn't do that here, but I said that that's the context, go from, the development of the internal combustion engine with oil and gasoline to the operationalization of the microwave spectrum, which is just sitting there and now is running half of our machines, to the solar panels that are running the satellites, because you can't do that. With satellites, very interesting problem. They tried, you couldn't put oil or coal or because once you needed to maintain a signal, the Soviets could put a satellite up there and then you could put dogs and whatever, but they just drifted off. But if you actually wanted to do something with these things, it had to be able to renew its energy source. So, long story, but photovoltaics they thought about putting nuclear energy power stations on satellites. That would have been an interesting development, but they didn't, but instead it was solar panels. So at every step along the way, this is a classic question in the history of technology. There are these so-called inventions, or there are questions about how, even in a more empirical way, how such things develop. Today, I find myself very frequently, I'm surprised it hasn't come up yet, but maybe, I don't know, because we're in a gallery, that AI is the kind of elephant in the technological room that is in principle new. The question, though, that is both new and old, and that I suggest that we address from within the humanities, the critical humanities that I'm referring to all these situations, both historical and recent, including the political ones, is what does it mean to be human? And under these circumstances. Now, I have something specific in mind. I have in mind the Turing test. Maybe you guys know that Alan Turing, I think there's another idea for the mid-20th century that's probably worth returning to in the debates about AI, because the problem in the Turing test, I actually wrote about this, I'm returning to my own work too, because this is my first book, basically there's a computer and a human and another human, and one human you can't see who's saying what, and eventually can't tell the difference from the responses given by the computer and the human, so that means the computer must be intelligent. Or can machines think, must be thinking. The problem as I interpret that, and this goes back to the alienation question, is what kind of a human are we that we can't tell the difference? What kind of so rather than just trying to recuperate our humanity from the machines, what kind of humans are we such that we need so many weapons? Who are we? What has happened historically? That's new. The U.S. budget, I've been paying a lot of attention, believe it or not, to the science budget for other extracurricular reasons that have to do with Columbia, but in the U.S. And they've been trying systematically to cut funding for science, not just to punish the universities, but to privatize science, and make the biggest military budget ever in something like $3 trillion, I think is the latest. So that obscene, that's barbarism. But it's a new kind of barbarism that's connected to the earlier barbarism. I'd rather call it barbarism. I know that does have moral overtones, but this is the language of Adorno and Horkheimer, and I still am wedded, and Benjamin, right, I'm wedded to that tradition in many ways. And the barbarism is the world in which a triumphal arch and a detention center make the same system of meaning make sense. And that is new. It's not brand new, obviously, and especially in those particular cases and building types and practices, by no means. But when you see this as not just one isolated event or technique, and you see it as a complex, then we can start saying that this sort of gestalt that we're able to recognize if we step back enough, is sufficiently new in a historical sense and perhaps in these other more philosophical senses that we can return to Nietzsche and ask about the uses and disadvantages of history for life. Because Nietzsche was really the great thinker of the question I think that you're asking. That's how I interpret it. I do go back to Nietzsche for that. And okay, what are we going to do with our historical knowledge about what's new and what's old and what it all meant then and what it means now? Well, here's the situation. Let's think about it.
Well,
Yeah, God, sure. You know.
Didn't mean like that it meant that it's not relevant. It's
No,
like
I know.
frustration that we already see the thing coming.
Yeah, I know. That's
Still cannot stop it.
Yeah.
That was the feeling I was coming.
That's No, I'm glad you said it, because that's why I'm suggesting that the left needs. There's a kind of reckoning on that needs to take. There was a bit of overconfidence on the left that it was just going to be about neoliberalism, and this is about neoliberalism, but that's only one side of this. That I was trying to explain how even within economic thought, these things run together ultimately. But this is about neoliberalism, but it's about the question of value. And that question of value is not just an economic question, it's a cultural question and a symbolic question and a moral one. And it's a question of life and death. And you know, we do have certain tools that allow, intellectually speaking, we have certain like apparatuses that allow us to interpret in these in certain ways. But, you know, for example, biopolitics as a way of, I've used this toolkit quite a lot myself, happy to, you know, refer to it. We could be thinking about the politics of immigration and so on and so forth, the management of the workforce in biopolitical terms, and that would get us a certain distance. But you know, Foucault was not able really to talk about the panopticon or other such machines as monuments, to go back to the Taiga problem. He only really thought about them in functionalist terms because he was reading, you know, the utilitarians. He was reading Bentham and Mill. And so I suggest, and of course Foucault was brilliant with respect to Kant, so it's always good to go back to Foucault, but you have to read these other aspects of these traditions as well, which are grappling with other questions. So the question here that puts your both questions to me together is the question of meaning. And that is where an attempt to render technology meaningful as symbolic form, for me, is an intervention politically into debates. Why? Because that's what our adversaries have been doing with other tools in other ways. So, yeah.
If I make a short comment, it will not be a question. It's fantastic then to hear your talk and then Jana's in conversation with Jana, because Jana brought up this long career roles, let's say, whatever, terrorists, in the dismantling of council housing, whatever. And I think this conversation of you two now also brought us to a little conversation here on the question of state, of the national state, like of in fact this kind of fake classicism, this kitschy fake classicism, barbarism that's now is present in all the rules of Trump. In this post-state socialist terrain, it's already in decay, like since 1990s, since this new national states in post-Yugoslavia or Slovakia, in my case, after the division of Czechoslovakia. All these nationalists, pretty right-wing nationalists, they were building their kind of cheap policies on this. But coming back to us theorists in architecture, there were this kind of roles like Karl Zeige in the creation of the new national state in Czechoslovakia, this bigger role that a colleague of mine here in Czech, seen Vendula Hnídková, a historian and tourist, so nicely researches how it was ideologically Zeige who prevented garden cities and this kind of Siedlungs of Tesenov style to find roots in Czechoslovakia, right? And I think this kind of Teutons or whoever, this kind of right conservative theories of architecture coming after 1989 beat Hungary or Czechoslovakia to find kind of intellectual friends with those who write, as you say, who signed the laws and everything. Like, what are our shared values? Like, is it detention centers or is it our shared values in 1990s? Even if we had Václav Havel, was zero immigration from bad countries, right? It was like, unfortunately, culturally the shared values are not detention centers, but our part of Europe, the post-state socialist, even helped very much now to the whole Europe, like last week, to sign this third country's detention centers where immigrants will not come here. It was just last week the European Union even signed it. So when Leahy, the theorist of politics, the Albanian one, says that the biggest problem is the capitalism and national state today, because this kind of forms of symbolism, or let's say from symbolic form or technology symbolic form that says nothing, it's so much today already for maybe at least 35 years since 1989, is the last big turn, so much connected to the crisis of the national state, the total decay and crisis of what the national state is, how architecture represents it, and what we intellectualize about this form as a national state.
Well, no, there's a lot there, but you reminded me of something else I wanted to say in response to Jana, about Cassirer first. So Cassirer and Scruton worked together under Prince, now King Charles, on Poundbury, which is one of the new urbanist, kind of neo-traditional so-called developments in the UK. But more than that, there was a Cassirer. I've written actually about in the book on postmodernism and utopia. Cassirer was the author of a plan for Luxembourg. This is one of his unbuilt, sort of finely drawn kind of projects. That was meant to be. It was when the headquarters of the European Union were being explored. Like different cities were competing to be the headquarters of the European Union, and it was a kind of counter project for Luxembourg that rendered Luxembourg in stone, basically, as you would imagine, a kind of Cassirer type project, and lots of disalienated workers, by the way. It's kind of Ruskinian. And I think one needs to understand that, especially when you connect these other dots. I didn't write about this as explicitly in that, but I did write about that project in a manner that points in this direction. As a project that wants to, that imagines or sort of projects a Europe for the Europeans. A European stone cut by European stonemasons, white, of course, all very, it's saying without saying that and the nation in that sense, it's the Heimat kind of understanding of nation, has been displaced or decentered onto Europe. But it's a very specific idea about Europe that was posited against cosmopolitan, which is to say modernist Europe. That's Brussels. And that's, what actually happened. So the other part, though, I was going to also say, and it's related to the housing and so on, is that in the States, this is also, I think, true in the UK. It'd be interesting to compare, the different architectural cultures and to see how far this holds. That when these culture warriors, the classical architects and so on, get together, and what they've been working on is not just a stylistic question. It's important to recognize, this is another thing that in art history and architecture, we need to really rehabilitate critically the concept of style around these questions. It's easily dismissed by all the social historians that I teach. It's not dismissible. It cannot be dismissed. Why? Because it's a collective project. Style is by definition collective. And that's, of course, one of the big, it's in between the lines of what you're talking about. So, but it also, this has been associated with a very schematic distinction that is very effective politically, like at a level of popular politics that also kind of runs deeper into the academy. That where something like modernism, I think the Taiga schema fits this to some extent, is functionalist or brutalist even architecture, is associated with the welfare state, with a kind of socialist, social democratic project. This is definitely, Scruton does this explicitly in the book. It's called The Aesthetics of Architecture, so I don't know on that, but he compares two forks. One is a Danish fork style, Scandinavian fork, and the other is a classical fork. And you can imagine where this goes. And there's two ideas about society. One is the welfare state, basically, modern welfare state, and the other is, it could be, it's really the political philosophy that is most influential. It's very influential on people like J.D. Vance, in fact, these days, is called Aristopopulism. It actually, they go back to Aristotle and they say, no, actually, the elites do need to rule, but with the consent of the that's the populist part. With the populace is summoning the elites to govern them. So that's what the classical fork is about. I mean, it's not a one-to-one because Strutin's a political philosopher of a slightly different conservative kind than. I'm talking about somebody like Patrick Deneen, who everybody should also read. I reviewed a couple of Deneen's books in places online if you want a shorthand about classical architecture and front porches and neo-traditional things. So, but there are ways of life and political economy associated with that. So the idea is to demolish all the functionalist buildings or the brutalist buildings in Washington. Why? Because those are about the welfare state. So that literally they're dismantling the agencies, the institutions of the welfare state, and replacing them with, Tesla, and building the classical in its place. So it's never just one thing or the other. There's always a dialectical encounter between different, essentially political hypotheses, and that's what I think, where the housing question comes in and the style question comes in and so on. It's not just a fetish, and it's not just kitsch in that way. It functions in a very practical way to enable, to encourage, to sustain the dismantling of what remains of the welfare state. So, okay. Thank you. Thank you, Jana. Great questions. Thank you.